Right, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Stuart Waiton again to talk about this very topical issue of grooming gangs. And Stuart, you wrote an article on this back in 2021, I understand.
I did.
Why that article, and what did you find?
Well, there's a couple of things that had triggered me on this. Was that I remember sitting reading the Times, probably about 6 years ago, something like that. And I was just flicking through. I don't normally read the Times. I was just flicking through it and going through it page. And then I got through, and it might not have been that far in, but it felt like it was about page 46. And there was a kind of list. There was a little thing down the side panel about a grooming gang. Can't remember which one. And it was a picture of like 12 Asian-looking guys. Grooming gang, hundreds of girls, blah, 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 found guilty, etc. And I thought, why is that on page 46, right? It doesn't make any sense to me, right? And this is, bear in mind, I mean, this is a good example of the problem that I'm going to sort of like now say, by the way, I'm not racist. But bear in mind, I've like historically, that was racism and anti-racism. That was the first thing that interested me in politics. Was campaigns against racism. So I don't have much of an instinct for wanting to kind of like find or play a race card. So I'm just looking at this and thinking, this is bizarre. And I'm kind of looking up as if I can talk to somebody and say, you know, there's nobody around. And I was just scratching my head about it, thinking, this seems weird. Surely if you've got 12 guys who've gang raped hundreds of kids, isn't that a national news story? You know, is this not front page stuff? And, you know, while you might not want to sort of, you might be conscious that it's controversial or whatever, nevertheless, you know, I mean, that's a big story. Surely this is a big story. And it's on page sort of 46 or somewhere, like down the column. Right? So that got me, already I was thinking, this is very peculiar. And then the government report came out, Home Office report, I think in 2021. And it came with headlines from The Guardian that read, what was it, something like, most child sexual abuse gangs are white, right? And that's the headlines. And it's like, you know, loads of report says, right? And I thought, oh, right, okay, let's have a look at this. So I looked at the report. And of course, the report, it's like everything about it, you can feel them falling over themselves, trying not to find a race angle. So, and what they did, I mean, interestingly, they said things like, it says, there's not enough evidence to show the majority of these gangs are Asian, right? Because of the paucity of evidence. So you think, well, that's interesting. How is there paucity of evidence for that? But you can say categorically that the problem is more to do with white people, right? Surely if there's paucity of evidence, there's paucity. Anyway, so I looked into it, and, you know, the evidence is not great because people aren't collecting evidence, right? What they looked at was limited, and there was already a kind of, there was a Labour Party woman at the time said, well, why don't you just look at the convictions? Right, and then you could just go and see the people who've been convicted of these offences, and then you'd have an idea, right? That would give you a clue. And of course, we're all familiar with the pictures, right? You see pictures, and so if you Google images of, you know, it's like all these different towns all over the place, 50 towns, and every single picture is of Asian guys, right? There's like maybe some odd white guy, I think. So you think, well, how can these things both be true? It doesn't seem to make any sense. Of course, what they do is, so they've got relatively weak evidence, but the evidence that they've got, the little local pieces of research, and they say things like, you know, this percentage of white people were involved in sort of sex offences, and this number of Asian people. But they didn't take into account the fact that the number of Pakistanis in the country is 2% of the population. Right, so you could say 4% if you just said for the East Asian population. I think it's East Asian, is it West Asian? Anyway, South Asian. So basically, they did all this without factoring in relative populations. So in terms of absolute numbers, it's still the case that there's more white people involved in sex cases with kids. But in terms of the sort of nature of gangs and relative to the population, as far as I can tell, it's unquestionably the case that there is a problem, and a particular problem with a section of Pakistani men. And that's just, as far as I can see, that's just true. It's just objectively true. And they're doing everything in their power not to say that, and to invert it and say actually the problem is it's a more of a white problem. Right? So I wrote an article about that, and I was interested. I actually contacted Kenan Malik, who I know from my past left wing days, who writes for the Guardian, because he was trying to deny this. So I sent him my article and said, I'd love to know what you think. And at the time, he was writing articles for the Guardian saying, where's your evidence? Right. So I sent my article. I says, well, this is my evidence by looking at their evidence. So I'm wondering what you think about it. But of course, now we're getting more evidence. And there's like statistics from the criminal justice system itself that shows a significantly disproportionate number of Pakistani men, four times more, which doesn't mean that, there's not lots of white pedophiles and abusers. There are more than Pakistani men, substantially, but proportionately to the population. And in relation to this specific type of crime, it is, as far as I can see from all statistics I've looked at, all the evidence, it is unquestionably the case that there is a proportion of Pakistani men who have been involved in these cases. And as far as I can see, it's unquestionably the case that officials have tried to have been frightened to do anything about it, right? For a variety of reasons. So that's probably what was discussed.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you think they're frightened of? Were they frightened of backlash, or were they frightened of upsetting a group of people that they want to keep on side?
I think there's a lot of things, actually. In fact, you could probably write a mini pamphlet on this. So to start with, I would say there's an issue to do with multiculturalism, in terms of multiculturalism as a new progressive morality, almost, rather than politics. So you're a good person if you are multicultural and celebrate cultures and all the rest of it. So you'll probably remember they used to have these banners up, one Scotland, many cultures. Don't know if you remember this. I remember partly because there's a guy doing a PhD, a critical PhD, while I was doing mine, and he was looking at this campaign, right, and saying, what does this mean? What is anti-racism? What does this idea mean? And he interviewed the guy that did this thing. Of course, what happened was they did one country, many cultures, and then people raised questions about, well, isn't that? I think there was some issues happening at the time, kind of a bit of tension with different groups and so on, and so they dropped it. I can't remember how they changed it. They changed the logo, so it wasn't just a sort of like complete multicultural celebration. But anyway, you get the idea that through the sort of mid-90s into the new millennium, multiculturalism was becoming a kind of a must for right-thinking people. Mm-hmm. So there's that. That's one dimension of it. The other dimension of it is that there's a new form of snobbery that comes with that. So there's a form of snobbery where and this is a broader problem, actually, where we perceive the public as being bigoted racists, massively beyond what any serious analysis would tell you about social attitudes. Social attitudes are very liberal and very anti-racist, in fact, but the perception is the opposite, and particularly by the kind of professional classes. So that, I think, added to the multiculturalism, was a kind of a disaster waiting to happen, because you can't then hold different groups to account in a way that you would expect. And they are terrified of the white working class, who they think are a kind of, they imagine it's like a Simpsons, group of people with pitchforks and torches and all the rest of it. So they've got this going on in their head, and they talk about it. I mean, they're quite open about this idea, problem of social disorder, right, and community cohesion. So they use all these terms, and the police say social workers are conscious of it, counsellors are conscious of it. What will this mean? Will there be riots? What will the Muslim community do? And then on top of that, you've got the confusion about age. Something I've seen, you've looked into this, that age of consent, and the idea of a 14, 15-year-old girl having sex is kind of like neither here nor there for the officials who are meant to be child protection services, again, because they're liberal, and so on. So you end up, if I was reading one today, which is, it's because a friend of mine had mentioned this, that was a 15-year-old Muslim girl got married in this country to like an old guy, right, who'd basically been abused and blah, 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 and got married, and the social worker gave it the thumbs up. And you're going, how is that even possible? But yeah, apparently, 15-year-old, just you can look it up, 15-year-old social work, married, Muslim married, social worker gives it the thumbs up. I thought that would be called rape.
Yeah, I had heard of that story. Just going back to the fear, like the fear of backlash, fear of the white working class, right, or whatever. I mean, does experience suggest that fear is justified, even if it doesn't justify their actions in keeping things secret or whatever? But it is actually a fear founded on a real risk.
I don't know. I think the problem is once you start lying and hiding things, then people get angry. I mean, if people from the outset had said this is disgraceful, you will be held to account and you will be punished like everybody else, then there might have been some genuinely far right types might have tried to make hay out of it. But if the authorities are all over it, which they should be, and they're saying people will be held to account, we expect the same standards of behaviour, this is the abuse and rape of children, they're going to be locked up, made an example of, and then it would quite possibly nip it in the bud. People would know. You'd have police operations that really go into communities and say, if any of this happens, you're in serious trouble. You're going to be in prison for a very, very long time. Then that's what should happen. And if there's then people riot, then you punish them for rioting. You don't lie to the public. And
no, it's counterproductive. And once you've lost the faith of the public, then they're going to conspiracy theories will flourish, even when it's not true. People will think, well, it probably is true because they keep secrets. So.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's like the case if there's a terrorist attack. To start with, they're loath to say it's a terrorist attack, and they're loath to say the man of the attacker, right? Whereas I'm not sure that if that was a BNP guy, whether that would be the same, because it tends to be. I would expect if there was a BNP terrorist attack, they would say, this is a right-wing terrorist attack, and his name's Bob Smith, and he's from Coventry. Right? That's what you would get. Whereas, my expectation, if there's like children killed but en masse or like a bomb or something like that, and they don't tell you the name, I'm just waiting for the name to be a Muslim name, because I've just seen it too many times, and you just think, well, stop doing it, right? People can see it.
I think with the Southport attacker, they said there was no evidence of any ideology, and yet there seemed to be quite a bit that he was into the critical race theory, decolonializing white privilege. But I would guess the investigators probably think, well, that's not an ideology. That's just proper right thinking. So how could that possibly motivate some murderous attack? Yeah. So I would imagine that option, or the possibility of that being a driving ideology, wasn't really taken seriously, because they think, oh, that's what we think. So I don't go around murdering people. So how could that possibly be it? Just today, I watched an absolutely fascinating.
Sorry, I was just going to say on that, the fact that he said there should be a white genocide might be a bit of a giveaway on that one as well. You know?
Did he say that?
Yeah, he did. Yeah. He said.
Oh, right.
He wanted.
I'm not there. How could anyone leap to the conclusion that could have been a motivation?
A slight problem. I mean, I try and be as open-minded as possible, because I know, I'm already sort of looking for something. And these kids mouth off. Kids say all sorts of stupid things. Kids might look at stuff online. It doesn't necessarily mean. So I'm prepared to kind of bend the stick a little bit. But I mean, there were so many red flags with this kid. But anyway, sorry, you were saying.
I was just saying, Humza Yousaf. I watched a video of him. I hadn't seen it before. I don't know how I've not seen this before. Of him speaking in his younger days. He looked at least a decade or two younger. And he was saying that there's a problem, especially among my community, of people objectifying women, particularly women of other ethnicities. That was Humza Yousaf speaking as a Pakistani there, which you'd have to put him on the rack to get him to say that now, I'm sure. But in a moment of candor, he could see a problem then.
That's interesting.
Very interesting, because I find it's really difficult to find any sort of analysis of what is it within this culture. I mean, people have said like it's a subculture within Pakistani. I mean, it can't be bad when I say it's people from a peasant background or whatever. So even if it's a subculture within a subculture, what is it that's there? That's what needs to be got to the bottom of. And I find there's not much to go on. There's not, the research and investigation doesn't seem to have taken place, and it's just left as a mystery. I mean, with these people like phoning up their cousins in other towns in the north of England saying, "Hey, do you know what we do? You should have a try at this," or is it just so ingrained in the culture it just seems a natural thing to do wherever you are? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is my take on it, but I mean, this is just presumption. So I lived in Pollokshields. And Pollokshields, for people who don't know, is in Glasgow, and it's the main Asian area of Glasgow. Right. So my upstairs neighbour, or my downstairs neighbour, and my other neighbour, one was from Malaysia, she was really against the Pakistanis. She had a very bad opinion. It's partly because there were genuine gangs there, and this is where there was that kid who was killed by one of them. And the other one was it was Kashmir. From, and he was a decent guy. So there's plenty of decent people, but there was also the white middle class women that I knew were nervous of the kids because they treated them like dirt, and they were a bit out of control. Some of these kids. And it did feel like there was a kind of law unto themselves, and there was open misogyny towards, and I don't like the word misogyny because I don't think many people do hate, but I think there was an element of both contempt and an element of hatred towards white women. And I think the peasant thing there's probably truth to that. So what I take from that is that they're from relatively backward cultures, so not very modern. Not very Western, as we would say, but there'll be cities in Pakistan that are pretty modern, have got a pretty what we would see as a relatively modern outlook. Even if you still have a kind of a different rules between men and women. But then I think what adds to that is there is an element of almost race hate involved in these gangs. I think the purposeful targeting of other groups, whether that's, and it wouldn't have just been white girls, but predominantly it does seem to be very much that. So an element of contempt, and almost a kind of like inverted type of racism, where you're getting your own back. You've got a kind of certain outlook, which again is a problem in terms of what historically you would have wanted, and which would have happened with immigrants coming into the country, would have been that they come here with a sense that they want to be British. That doesn't mean that they would lose their religion, but they would want to be British. Whereas with this, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like you've got a certain group of people coming into the country who've got an element of contempt already, who are from relatively backward areas in terms of modern expectations, and then they're allowed to get away with it. And that's the, you see, all the other stuff, I can live with the other stuff, because you think, well, you know, okay, as long as they follow the law and all the rest of it, you know, it might not be ideal, but it's the authorities that are the problem. I mean, I think any sort of right-wing group or anybody that wants to focus on the Muslim issue, I think they're missing the point, because for me, that's not the point. The point is social workers, counsellors, police, journalists, BBC, they just all allowed this to happen. They allowed tens of thousands of children to be gang raped, right? That's what happened. That's what's key. Because if the authorities had come down really hard immediately, as soon as there's any sniff of this, as they should, they would have, I can only imagine, it would stop. They would nip it in the bud. Everyone would know. That's the end of it. But they didn't. They're the ones that I see as being profoundly responsible, and that's where our focus attention should be, which is why any sort of inquiry, that's what you would want to be looking at. You would want to be looking at the authorities. What were the police doing? What were the councillors doing? What was the press doing, and all that?
And Hamza Yousaf's made it clear he absolutely has not learned that lesson.
Yeah,
he still tries to racialize every case. So he says people who draw attention to the Pakistani grooming gangs, that's for racial reasons. Then he was tweeting about that the white gang recently in Scotland, saying, "Oh, the reason they're not talking about that." I mean, to be honest, he's right. I mean, there are people who jump on it just because there's a race angle or an immigration angle, and that's part of their wider agenda. There's people who do that, but Hamza Yousaf is very definitely doing the same thing from the other perspective, which is equally unhelpful. But just on that topic, talking about the grooming gangs. That the people have been Muslims. I would imagine that they're not actually very committed religious Muslims, I would imagine. Now, when I hear about an Islamic terror attack, I'd have to say, when people say, oh, they weren't really Muslims, I tend to think, well, I think they probably were. That they were extremely serious about their Muslim faith, and they were following what they thought was the right interpretation of it. So I don't buy that, they weren't really proper Muslim. Well, but I think with these, because I mean, Islamic morality, mainstream Muslims would not be approving of this sort of thing. So I'd be surprised if any of them, with the pillars, if they're the Quran study group on a Tuesday night, I wouldn't imagine that was the case. But what you're saying about the cultures, though, the backwards cultures, I mean, you can imagine someone saying that, obviously, that this is why we need to be promoting feminism to everyone as the antidote to these values. And I suppose in some ways it is an antidote to those values. But I think so is traditional conservative values as well. They're also an antidote to these values. But the assumption within the mainstream, it's just that there's two positions. There's the very misogynistic, mistreating women have no rights, and there's feminism. And there's just a spectrum in between. And it's as simple as that. But I think it's not that simple. Not that simple at all. So.
No. It's just, I mean, it's about treating people equally and with an element of respect, and especially understanding what a child is a pretty useful starting point, and we seem to be losing that as well. I mean, just on whether they're these terrorists are real Muslims. The thing is, I think Islamism is more like politics than religion.
I would say Islam is inherently political.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that's why it's like the people who get involved in this stuff and do these things, I don't think of them as religious. I think of them as political extremists, which takes a religious form. I suppose that's That's the way I think about it. But
right. I may say the other way. It's more that it's a strictly literal, I would say even face value interpretation of a lot of Muslim texts, because there's a lot in the Quran, there's a lot in the life and example and writings of Muhammad that, if taken at face value and implemented in a literal sort of sense, would lead to violent extremism. So I think Islam relies on interpretation that takes those very, very rough edges off it and produces something more palatable and mainstream. So I think the extremists are, they're the fundamentalists, the literalists of the religion, in my view. But just you mentioned the age of consent issue. I think there's a few issues here. The sex education issue, age of consent, letting underage girls have abortions, turning a blind eye to underage sex, etc., etc. I think that's a huge factor here. I think it would be much more difficult, if not impossible, to have operated these sort of grooming gangs if we had a different culture around child sexuality. Would you agree with that?
I would, yeah. I think it does seem that because of the nature of the offences, this is not like your, as I understand it, this is not like your normal paedophile type setup. This is, well, maybe this is how it works in general, but this is guys who, taxi drivers and so on, young girls, often who are in children's homes, out on the street, and they say, "Oh, we could get you a drink. We could, if you want some drugs, jump in the car." Blah blah blah, and they keep doing it, and they befriend them, and then they end up getting them more drunk, more drugs, and then having sex, and that just becomes a normal run-of-the-mill thing. So, the people who are aware that this is happening say, "Well, it's voluntary because the girls are doing it and they're a bit out of control. This isn't coercion, and so on." But yeah, I think to get to that point, especially when you're talking about, I was funny, I was talking to my daughter about this, and I was trying to kind of like play with the ideas and say, should we not be a bit liberal? It's like if every 15-year-old who had sex, we sort of started to throw the law and blah blah blah, even if the boyfriend's 18. And as she pointed out, she said, yeah, but that's, you might want to be flexible with stuff like that, but these guys are not 18, they're 30 and 40 and 50, and anyone that thinks that that's normal is insane. And she also said, and I'm just taking her word for it on this, she says, you ask any girls her age, young women her age in Dundee, who the beasts are, and they'll tell you it's Asian guys, right? Old Asian guys who creep around these girls, right? Because you never get, it's like almost never get a white guy that does that. It's just it's a known thing that you get these beasts who, like 45-year-old guy who owns the shop, and he creeps around these young women.
But we've got the culture, though, that in some circumstances, it's perfectly fine for a 13-year-old girl to have sex, as long as it's in the right circumstances. So if a person believes that, then the idea of having sex with someone older, it's not so outrageous for the older person or for the 13-year-old girl. It's like just bending the rules a little bit. So I think it makes it easier for them to persuade girls to go along with that. And I think if there was a dramatic culture change, that would make a massive difference. A few little things from a few of the reports recently. This was a big case that came out in Glasgow a little while ago. The prosecution withdrew evidence that the abusers used a Ouija board, called on spirits and demons, made the victims believe they could communicate with spirits and demons, and made them take part in witchcraft. And apparently the prosecutors dropped it because they thought that the jury would find it unbelievable. it would just sound like fantasy to them. I wonder if, again, that's a case where people assume that just must be window dressing. It's just some trivial acting they were doing, rather than an actual motivation behind it. And I found that, yeah, quite interesting. So, how many other cases do these cases come to court and they strip away what might be a ritual element because they think it will just sound too outlandish to the jury and will damage their credibility? Yeah, again, so the problem for me is, as when I read that, now when I hear about other cases, I'm left thinking, oh, I wonder what else was at play here. And that's the way, that's so they can get totally out of control. You get wacky conspiracy theories, but it's almost inevitable when you know it's been swept under the carpet. In this case, this is interesting. Some of the grooming gang, the report in Scotland said in towns and cities, grooming gangs tended to operate with a sort of party flat type modus operandi. In rural areas, it was more offering lifts, taking advantage, like, you know, so the kids could get into the town or into the city. That was interesting. The study in Scotland. Sorry,
nothing done about it. You know, that's the other thing that is, you know, worth questioning, is that why have there been no grooming gang cases in Scotland? Not a single one that I'm aware of. It doesn't mean that there was one case where 14 people were deported at the end of it, but, you know, I never heard about that, and I don't think anybody else did either. But
the police decided not to publicize it.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So the police have been put on the spot, and the police said, we have to think very carefully about which cases we publicize and which ones we don't, bearing in mind a range of factors. Right. So basically it was, I don't know if cover-up's the right word, but they would normally have publicized a case like that. Yeah, and I've read about exactly that case. Yeah, one was an Afghan man prosecuted, 14 deported, but the case involved far larger number of men of other races, minority races, and nothing ever came through.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, if the press were doing their job, right? I mean, you know, the BBC in particular, because the BBC have got resources like nobody else has, in terms of being able to cover court cases. They would have known about this. They're not interested. It's like, I mean, the BBC are an absolute disgrace at the minute, I have to say. I mean, it's just astonishing. The framework of news at the BBC and how they frame everything is through a kind of diversity lens. You know, if it rocks the sort of multicultural boat at all, they're not going to cover it, right? Or they'll certainly cover it in a way which tries to sort of temper that or highlight the white whatever, etc. I mean, you know, so I mean, it's like, you know, as you say, it's a significant case that no one's ever heard of. You know?
No, absolutely. But I don't know if you read this. This is from the Scottish Government's current guidance about child sexual exploitation. It says, this is a quote, having sex with strangers, in brackets adults, should be regarded as a red flag for unsafe behavior that might involve abuse or exploitation. So a child having sex with an adult might be a red flag. Might, I mean, just, again, like you're saying, it's the assumption that, well, this might all be, well, you know, just a child being a bit wild and a bit out of control.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter, does it? I mean, that's the thing. It shouldn't make any difference. I do worry that part of this is that there is a real contempt for white working class girls. You know, the white working class in general, because part of the multicultural framework, even though it's rare that they'd come out and say this, is a contempt for whiteness. But in particular, the white working class, which is why the sort of Hillary Clinton deplorable basket of deplorables category, you know, Trump winning this election, and everything else, is that people are entirely aware that this is the kind of the framework, so that if you look at an advert, you'll almost never have a white family. It has to be mixed race at best. In fact, I don't know if you've noticed this, but I would put a sizable bet that this is true and the case. If you look at the white people that are represented in adverts, more often than not, they're ginger or a bit ginger, right? And the reason for that, I'm absolutely convinced about it, is because gingerness, they've managed to scrape themselves onto the kind of pyramid of oppression, because being ginger somehow is like that's really difficult because you're called ginger or something. Right? So
there's a significant body of literature on it, apparently, ginger prejudice.
Yeah. So honestly, you look at adverts now. So not only will you almost never have a white family unless it's a white family that are doing something particularly bad. But almost never. It'll always be mixed race, or preferably sort of like a black and an Asian, or whatever it is. And if it's white, it'll be ginger, a bit ginger, right? So that's how insane they are. That's how mad the sort of cultural elites are.
Yeah, and you can't make an advert with the woman putting the clothes in the washing machine,
right?
Or a man knocking a nail in to make sure you're point blank not allowed to do that in an advert.
Yeah.
It can't reinforce gender stereotypes.
Yeah.
That's the rule. So if you try to make an advert selling an electric drill and you had a man drilling a hole in the wall, then that would be banned. You wouldn't be able to do that. I mean,
I haven't noticed the drilling ones, but definitely the dishwashing ones. They're almost always, not always. I've seen one. I think I've seen one that's got a woman, or at least a woman voiceover, possibly.
If you have if a man's doing it first, you can maybe get away with a woman doing it later on.
Yeah. My point about this, and this is I had a huge row with my brother who's an actor, because about 6-7 years ago, his agent told him that he should expect 70% fewer offers of jobs because it'll be going to women and black people now, and because he's a nice guy, he says, "Oh well, that's just the way it is." So I was having a huge row with him about adverts, and essentially it's racial discrimination, and you shouldn't, as I was completely opposed to racial discrimination when it was used against black people, I am also completely opposed to racial discrimination the other way around. It's completely unhelpful and divisive and contemptuous and patronizing. There's nothing good about it. But my point about this is the advert example and the ginger example sound kind of like obscure, but if it's true, which I'm pretty sure it is true, and certainly the sort of not having white families is absolutely true, you can see there's an element of contempt already for for whiteness. What is a positive identity? What is a negative identity? And that's already built into this kind of critical race theory idea about whiteness, about history, slavery, racism, and so on. That is what kids get taught in history lessons now.
Yeah.
And so whiteness and the white working class in particular, if you have a multicultural outlook, which you tend to be encouraged to have in the professions and the professional classes, the likelihood is you will have a potentially modern snobbery towards the white working class. And then all of a sudden this comes along, you've got Asian men and white working class girls who are having sex with them, and they're like, either don't say it or somehow manage to find some explanation for why this shouldn't be something that they should be concerned about. And that's the sin. That's the outrage of this whole thing. And they're the people who should be being looked into. That's what a proper investigation should be looking at. And people should be naming names, finding emails, and identifying people who allowed mass rape of children to happen across the country.
Yeah. A bit more from the report. You mentioned that one. It was like 2011. The case finished 2014. 27 men were reported to the Crown Office. Significant proportion from ethnic minority communities, but a large-scale trial didn't take place. One culprit, an Afghan asylum seeker, was jailed, and this is the one I think where 14 of them were deported. But then what happened? What happened with the rest? Just nothing happening. Then another one. a third police investigation into ethnic minority grooming gangs in Glasgow called Operation Sarah. 55 suspects, Kurdish, Afghani, Egyptian, Moroccan, Turkish, Pakistani, and Iraqi. And again, what happened with it? It just seems to have petered out and gone nowhere.
Yeah, I think they're close. But this is also, so Bernardo's in Scotland 2020 had a report saying that there was problems of child sexual exploitation in 27 of the 32 councils. Part of this involved, as you say, they also noticed this thing about red flags, right? Girls having sex with men, children having sex with men might be a red flag. Yeah. They're also the ones with party flats. You know, this is the kind of run-of-the-mill risky sexual behaviour, and they put this forward, and nothing's done about it. There's no serious attempt to try and investigate this issue. So Scotland just seems to have nothing, nothing at all.
Yeah. Just going back to the north of England towns in particular, they've really been the epicenter of this issue. I heard someone say a little while ago, I find it very interesting. Multiculturalism has got its challenges and its downsides, and there can be a lot of tensions. But you really need to start worrying when you get biculturalism, when you've got two similar sized groups in one place. So it becomes like who runs the council becomes a bit of a power struggle between the two. And you're either in or out in each issue. And that's the situation, I think, in a lot of towns in the north of England, where basically there's sort of white, indigenous, British population, and there's a sort of Pakistani, Asian, Muslim population as well. And they're of comparable sizes, and maybe even the Muslim part larger. And within that, that's ideal breeding ground for feuds and intergroup tensions, isn't it? Because each group focuses on what the other group did to one of their people. They can ignore what some of their people did to the other group. So I wonder what, to an extent, that played a part. That the tensions are so strong that they really dislike, despise, distrust, devalue, whatever, people from the other community. So therefore, when it comes to mistreating them, it's almost a chance to score a goal for your side. If you manage to hit back at someone from the other community, considering all they've done to us, then, they deserve all they get. So do you think that could be a factor?
Yeah, I see, again, I think that is a factor, potentially in certain areas, but I also, again, think that the problem has been with the kind of multicultural establishment, because once you started to get this promotion of multiculturalism, it encouraged different people to adopt the idea that this is my community, right? So it didn't mean that black people were always integrated brilliantly when they came in initially in the 50s and 60s, but in the 70s. But that was partly, I think, to do with there was racism at the time, and a number of them were treated poorly in terms of jobs, housing, and opportunities, and so on. But nevertheless, there was no real idea that you would encourage them to think of themselves as a separate community. Right? The opposite would be the case, that you would want them to join the Labour Party and become a socialist, or become a, whatever, or join the Conservative Party and, blah, 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 and all the rest of it. And so you would get kind of Indians joining the Conservative Party, Pakistanis who working class joining the Labour Party, and so on. Whereas from the kind of the mid-80s onwards, there was this promotion of multiculturalism and saying, oh yeah, we'll fund you as your community. We'll give you money. And it started under Margaret Thatcher, ironically. We'll give you money for your Muslim community. And you're almost being paid to be a separatist. Right? And so, the situation you see in America, which obviously is absolutely horrendous in terms of the kind of ethnic, basically, if you're not black, you're not going to get voted in this area. If you're not white, you're not going to get voted in this area, which is absolutely horrendous. That's encouraged. So you end up encouraging a generation of people to see themselves as part of our community, rather than part of a country, or part of a political outlook or whatever. you actually encourage separatism. So again, I think the authorities are to blame for this. I think they've entirely encouraged, with their kind of relativistic, anti-national, multicultural morality, they've encouraged divisions, and that's completely unhelpful.
Yeah, I think from the situation we're in, I suppose there's also the danger that, you know, if you're top of your political priorities, you know, you're an anti-immigration party, then it's in your interest to be presenting bad news stories about immigrants, because that strengthens your case and it stirs up hostility towards immigrants and immigration. It helps your political cause. But no matter how true the things they bring up, the price is paid in terms of a harmonious society, because that makes immigrants or Muslims or whatever less likely to feel, oh, well, we're all in this together, we're all in the same nation. So that makes it worse. Then you've got the other side who'll respond even more enthusiastically. Oh, we think you're wonderful. You make an amazing contribution. What fantastic people you are. How much money can we give you for your new community center or whatever? Then you've still got that going on as well. But it's like, it's so long as those two movements are strong, I just see that the division is going to get worse and worse, because each side of the division is being stoked up. Yeah, with genuine grievances in some cases.
If it is being, I mean, the thing is, if it has been stoked up purposefully for negative reasons, then that's a problem. But I do think that it seems entirely legitimate to raise a question about immigration in the context of some of the issues that are developing here. I mean, it's not entirely to do with immigration, because a lot of these people will be, some of these people will be born here. Mm-hmm. So it's not immediate immigration, but I do think the immigration issue needs to be resolved, because again, it's one of these issues where the public feel as if they haven't been listened to. And I mean, I would have a referendum personally. That's what I think. I think you should have a referendum on immigration. You should have two very clear proposals in terms of what immigration should be. People should then have to argue, because I think you can make a strong argument for immigration. Mm-hmm. At least then have to have a proper political discussion about what sort of immigration policy you want, and people would vote on it, and that would then give the politicians the confidence to actually do something about it. Because
they keep it in their manifestos, conservatives especially. They kept it in the manifesto, but they either didn't have the will or felt they didn't have the means to actually implement it. But I think the conservatives over the years, they were basically bowing to the BBC. They knew what would go down badly with the BBC, and therefore probably the rest of the media, and therefore they wouldn't dare do it. Yeah. So they allowed themselves to be hemmed in by BBC values, and they've ultimately paid the price for that. I mean, who knows how things will develop in the future, but there's a big price to pay. I think immigration is a classic case where public opinion is just not being reflected in the actions of parties. My take on it is, ideally, you don't want to get to the point where you have like an anti-immigration party, or a party where immigration is like one of its main things. You really want the mainstream parties to get a grip of it as a run-of-the-mill political issue, get a grip of it and sort out the issue. That's the ideal thing. Because once someone makes it their campaigning thing, as I say, it's in their interests to present bad news stories about immigration, rather than take a balanced view of the whole thing. You want a party that take a balanced view, saying this is what the electorate wants, we're going to do it. We're going to make the necessary changes. BBC can say what they like, we're going to do it. And I guess that was the job of the Conservative Party, but they just wouldn't do it for whatever reason. They did not do it.
Didn't have the will.
No. Right. Any parting shots on this topic? That was a very interesting chat.
Any parting shots? I thought I would mention, I don't know if you know, do you know the Audrey Dempsey story?
No. Just
because your listeners might want to watch out for this. So Audrey Dempsey is a Labour councillor, ex-Labour councillor in Glasgow, whose daughter had been telling her, she's from Springburn, I think it is. So she's a kind of community activist, does loads of charity work, runs a kind of a charity shop. And her daughter had mentioned that there was there was some sort of African gangs, like kids, immigrants, I think, early immigrants, possibly refugees, who were beating people up and filming it. And then it happened to her daughter, and she went to the school, and it was a kind of it was a bit of a grooming gang scenario, right? So it's like, oh, nothing to see here. The police were conscious that this was an issue, and she raised it with them. And then she wanted to table a question at Glasgow City Council about anti-white racism, about these gangs that are beating up white kids and girls included in filming it. And they refused to allow her to raise this question. They then suspended her from the Labour Party, and now she's being chased around by the media as an extreme right racist. And she's just, as far as I can see, I don't know, I haven't met her, but everything I've seen about and read about her, it's a kind of complete witch hunt against somebody for raising a genuine concern about the safety of her children who's been beaten up.
That tells you a lot about the Labour Party. I mean, what's the chance that this Labour Party activist and representative was actually some deep-seated racist? I mean, it doesn't really hang together. I was familiar with that story. I didn't know the name, but I had followed that story a little bit. Yeah, it's quite shocking. I mean, in Edinburgh, of course, the Labour leader of Edinburgh City Council resigned for sending texts of a sexual nature to male Ukrainian refugees. And there's a councillor from Stirling, I think, I can't remember the story. Has he just been convicted of stalking or something? It's unbelievable. If I think about the sample of people I know, how often do these sort of things come up? It's very, very rare. If you look at the elected politicians in Scotland, it's almost a selection criteria. It's unbelievable how many scandals come out relating to them. It's quite quite remarkable. Right, well, leave it at that. I'll encourage everyone, if you don't follow the Scottish Union for Education on social media, if you don't get their newsletter, do that. They do great work. I would say an increasing number of people writing very insightful articles about Scottish education. I certainly find it very helpful. So do go along and follow, and keep up the good work with that. Be great to speak again soon, Stuart. So thanks for this evening.
Thank you.